Hello everyone, this is Anuga Hera. Welcome to the 54th episode of Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving skills of people and their employability. Now, let me tell you more about Microsoft Art of Code. Microsoft Art of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technologies, topics related to programming, and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. This course is basically for people pursuing computer science. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. And today we have David Malan who is going to teach you building the mobile application. If you are a fresher and know how to build iOS application, you can earn 3 to 4 lakh. And if you are a professional and have experience, you can get much more than this. Now let's move towards the course. In the previous episode, we covered the course JavaScript for experienced developer and also some part of iOS development. In this episode, we will start with the remaining part of the iOS development. So let's get started.
OK, so let me do this. In our source 0, whether or not you're using XAMPP or just following along visually or using whatever other web server you prefer to run on your own laptop, I'm going to go into my CS76 directory. And I'm going to go to the HTML directory, where here I see, albeit in a desktop browser, the exact same poorly designed website that we saw a moment ago in that screenshot of an iPhone. And indeed, if I right-click on here and choose View Page Source, or Control-click on your white background, you'll see that here's the source code for this page. And here we have some very simple HTML. As predicted, there's an unordered list, as you said. There's a list item. There's an h1, a body, and all of this. And there's also this meta tag. And that's what makes things look better within the confines of this browser. But can we improve the aesthetic still? Well, let me go back and go into this CSS directory. And voila, what a pretty looking website now. And we've done this entirely by using CSS. And it does look, up until 2 weeks ago when Apple decided that all of iOS was changing aesthetically, this looks like what? An iPhone. Well, if we at least size it to the appropriate size. So let me go ahead here. Doesn't that look like your iPhone? So it kind of does, with the typical menu at the top and the sort of tabular list of menu options. And indeed, if I go ahead and click this, we see the sub page, which is lecture 0 or lecture 1. And if I keep clicking, I'll see more. But what did we not get? What features did not just happen on the screen? There's no animation, right? If you're a fanboy or girl of iOS and Apple more generally, you know that it's these little touches, like the sliding from side to side, that sort of makes the experience feel the way it typically does. But this, let me go back and do it again. If I hit the back button and then click lectures again, it just flips like a normal web page. So we're sort of mimicking the aesthetics of iOS, but we haven't really recreated it. So how could we go about getting some form of animation? Well, we probably need some more sophisticated CSS or some JavaScript, some actual logic to move content from side to side. But before we do that, let's go to the source of this page just to get a sense of what was going on here. So this is the source for this page. And if I maximize my window and zoom in here, there's only one line of code that's different. What jumps out at you? Yeah, so there's just the link tag up here, href equals ios.css. The relation is style sheet. So let's see what that is. Now, as you probably know from web development, I can just go up here, and I can say ios.css, enter, and I can see this page. And we won't dwell too much on the details here, but here's where I'm setting some font stuff and some margins. H1, so that was the title of the web page that said CSCI S76. We have a background color that I chose to mimic what Apple itself uses for its default blue shade. We're using a background image here to actually do a gradient. What does -WebKit-gradient mean? Most CSS properties and values don't begin with dashes. Yeah, it's a browser prefix. What does that mean?
So some of the newer CSS properties are different by browser. So I can't remember. I think WebKit is Safari, or is it Firefox?
WebKit is Safari and Chrome. Yep. Exactly. And MOZ is Firefox for Mozilla. So that's exactly right. There's often unsupported or new up-and-coming features of CSS that the various browsers begin to implement on their own. But if they don't necessarily adhere to a standard, or if it's just a browser-specific feature, they'll typically prefix that property or that value with a dash, then their unique identifier. WebKit is the engine that underlies Chrome, at least right now in Safari. Dash MOZ is the same thing for Mozilla. So this just means this is not a feature that's going to work probably on IE or on Firefox. But that's fine, because we're narrowing our focus for now just on WebKit or Chrome in this case, but it would work on Safari as well. And then I'm going to wave my hand at the rest of the details. But suffice it to say that if we tinkered enough with the CSS, even starting from a clean slate, we could replicate this iOS-looking website so that it ultimately looks like the familiar UI. But we don't get any of that scrolling with which users are familiar. So let's go back into one last directory, and let's introduce a framework here that's called Jquery Mobile. So you're probably familiar with Jquery if you know any JavaScript. If not, we'll dive into a bit of it tonight. But what you might not be familiar with are various frameworks for actually helping with the development of mobile-based websites. So if we look to pass this example here, we'll mention 3 tonight. So Jquery Mobile, as the name suggests, is a Jquery library, very popular library that's specifically geared around mobile user interface details. So we'll glance at some of its capabilities now. Phonegap is another framework that we won't look at tonight, but Phonegap is sort of this best of both worlds, whereby it's a framework, so downloadable code that someone else wrote, that you can use to implement native applications using HTML and JavaScript. So you don't even have to know Objective-C yourself. And we'll peel back that layer eventually, but for now, know that someone else has taken the trouble to figure out how to write the bare amount of Objective-C code that then embeds the equivalent of a web page inside of a native application so that we can just write web-based code, but still put it in the App Store, give it an icon on the home page so that it actually feels more like a native application, even though it's running somewhere else, typically on some web server. So that's another framework of interest. And then Sencha Touch, which is similar in spirit to Jquery Mobile. It helps us make aesthetics that are mobile friendly, but it's definitely a more complex framework than Jquery Mobile. So we'll just focus on the first of these. So if I go back to my other screen here, and I go into the framework sample code for today, now we have an UI that looks almost the same, but there is a little something that's different. Anyone recall what was absent last time? Yeah, so these little iOS-looking arrows. And if we go ahead and click on this row, notice that it's also highlighting just a little bit, which is nice, at least in the desktop environment. Now we have a little bit of sliding that goes on. So that, too, is pretty nice. But let's dive a bit deeper. We'll come back to this in a week or two, but I have in advance installed an application called iOS Simulator. So this is software that Apple distributes with Xcode, which is their integrated development environment for writing iPhone applications and Mac software. And if I pull it up here, it looks like this. So it looks like the screenshots I've been using earlier. And if I go up to Safari and click here, so even though it looks like a phone, I'm controlling everything with my keyboard and touchpad here. I'm going to go to http://localhost//jharvard. Damn it, what a bad mobile website. So why is this page so small all of a sudden again? So whereas up until now, all of the examples we've been looking at were written by me, and I included that meta tag, this particular page was generated automatically by whom? This is just a directory listing. Let me zoom in. So if you hold down, and we'll get to this in a couple weeks, if I hold down Option when clicking, I can pretend to have 2 fingers on my laptop screen. And then I just have to kind of scroll to get back to where I want at the top. So there's the text we were looking at. Who generated this directory listing? Yeah. Yeah, it was Apache. So much like you've seen on the internet, any web server, if you go to a folder that has the appropriate permissions, will just show you all of the files in that particular directory. Apache's doing that. Apache doesn't know I'm on a mobile device, and whoever wrote the Apache code didn't know or care about this meta tag for the viewport settings, so it's just super small. So at least when navigating these folders for Apache, we're going to get this annoyingly small screen. But that's OK. Let me just deal with it for a few moments. Go into my CS76 directory. Zoom in again, move it over here, and then go into Framework. And now it does look a lot more like a native iOS application, right? So we're not just fooling by using Chrome. This is the actual simulator, and it would work the same on your phone. The only catch is my phone probably can't talk to my laptop unless I jump through some hoops to get the Wi-Fi to cooperate to make that work. But now let me go ahead and click on Lectures, just as I did before. Let's click Lecture 0. Damn it, I've paid a price again. What's happening? Yeah, so I'm loading a new page, and as you might have just noticed in using an iPhone or an iPod Touch for some time, anytime you click a link on a new web page, the default Safari behavior inside of an iPhone or an iPod Touch is to very briefly show you the address bar because the URL is changing. Then it will push it away if you so choose. The problem is that there goes our mimicry of an actual native application. So again, we've paid this price. But someone argue in favor of nonetheless proceeding to implement, say, the course's website using HTML, CSS, maybe some JavaScript without ever touching or learning Objective-C. Works on all devices. It would work on an Android phone. Windows Mobile phone wouldn't look like it belongs on either of those devices, but it would certainly still work. Speed of development. Sort of 15 minutes later, we're done with the course's website. So we don't even have to look at a line of Objective-C, and it will be more complex. What's that?
Maintenance of different. You don't have to be changing like every single native app you have.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot easier to update because even though I'm using this local web server right now, if you imagine just uploading that to the real internet and some commercial web host, I can just upload my code in one central place and no one has to update their native software. They don't have to go into the App Store to run an update. It's just anytime they visit my page, it's just going to be the way I intend it. So that's a lot of arguments in favor, but we are paying some prices. There's the aesthetic blips that are happening, whether we use CSS or even a little bit of JavaScript. There is going to be some latency. In fact, one of the biggest complaints against making apps web-based is that they just tend to feel slower. If you're a Facebook user, up until a year or more ago, a lot of the Facebook application, even though it looked like a native application, was using embedded Safari windows inside of it and grabbing content from Facebook's web servers, which is nice because they're already very good at serving up web content, and all they had to do was implement a minimum amount of code to wrap those web pages. But a lot of people, maybe you among them, griped about the speed of the application. And over the past year or more, it's gotten much faster because there's a lot more native code. So just some of the trade-offs to consider. Yeah?
No hardware user access like the apps normally.
So that's another good one, too. And we'll come back to that later in the semester. But there's some really cool hardware underneath the hood in these iOS devices, right? You have things like a compass, you have an accelerometer, a gyroscope, and other hardware still. And some of that hardware is just not accessible to JavaScript or to a web browser. That's slowly beginning to change. And you can access more and more via JavaScript, and we'll see a little bit of that tonight. But there are some things that are beyond your reach. And that's a big one, too. The fact that you can put a native app in the App Store, whether for free or for some number of cents or dollars, is pretty compelling because it's hard to convince anyone to buy or pay for access to a website in the same way that they do something through the App Store. Yeah?
Could you put this into a frame, maybe? And then when you click on it, it wouldn't change the URL at the top?
Good question. Could you put the mobile website into a frame, an iframe, or an actual HTML frame so that it's the URL of the innermost frame that's changing? Yes, you could. The only thing is the URL at the top will never change, and maybe that's OK, but then you'll lose the ability to deep link to specific pages. But a good workaround. All right, so let's just take a quick look at how we implemented this jQuery mobile version. We won't spend much time on it. You'll be welcome to use it for the first project, and its documentation online is ample. But let's take a look at the underlying source code for that third and final incarnation of the super simple course website. Notice at the top, we've added another CSS file. This one happens to belong to jQuery Mobile itself, so I just read that off from the documentation. We've got our meta tag just like before. I've got a script tag, this time importing jQuery. And if unfamiliar with jQuery, or if unfamiliar with JavaScript itself, we'll come back to that shortly tonight. And then one other script tag referencing this jQuery mobile site. And then if we scroll down below, you'll actually see that I'm making use of a pretty handy HTML5 feature. So what attributes are jumping out at you at perhaps being completely new?
The data dash role.
Yeah, so data-role. That's not an actual valid HTML attribute. And what else? Data-theme. That's pushing it further. That, too, is not a standard attribute in HTML5, but this is actually a feature of HTML5. If you prefix an attribute with data hyphen, you can create any attributes you want. And they will not be flagged as invalid by a validator. The browsers won't choke on them. So this is a way of storing metadata often inside of your web page in a way that's going to be very accessible via something like JavaScript, but without resorting to hacks and coming up with your own tags and your own attributes, which the world did do for some time with HTML4 and XHTML, which often made browsers unhappy. So this is like a nice way of including metadata alongside your own data. But as for what jQuery Mobile is doing, well, why did I put data role? Why did I put data theme? I just read the documentation for jQuery Mobile. And jQuery Mobile essentially told me to make one div for each of the screens that I want to exist in that faux application. The first one being the home page, the next one being the lectures page, the third one being the lecture 0 page. So I just have a div here, including some links. And if we keep scrolling down further, you'll see another bunch of content, another page, so to speak, for lectures. And so in short, the folks at jQuery Mobile decided to leverage these arbitrary data attributes to create their own markup language, still using valid HTML5. And what do you think their JavaScript file does upon being loaded into this page, for those familiar already with some JavaScript? How does jQuery Mobile turn this HTML into the user interface we saw as this? What would you do if you were a library written in some language called JavaScript that's being loaded into the web page at the top, and you know that lying ahead of you is markup that looks like this? What does jQuery Mobile presumably do to turn this into that? So if I were jQuery Mobile, I would probably search through the web page somehow, looking for all divs that have what associated with them? A data role of page. Not asking you how to do this, just high level conceptually. So if I were jQuery Mobile, I'd probably do some kind of search of the whole web page, looking for divs that have a data role of quote unquote page. And then I'm going to do something aesthetically, probably involving some CSS, to create that rectangle that looks like a screen of a native application. And I'm going to do that again and again and again for each of the pages that are defined in here. And meanwhile, anytime I encounter a div who has a data role of header, for instance, well, that's when I'm going to deploy some of that nice gradient with the blue shading. And I don't know how I'm going to do that, but at least at a high level, that's all this library is doing. And so what's nice about jQuery Mobile is that you don't even need to know JavaScript to use it. You need to just follow their directions and mark up your own content using this div approach with these data attributes. Sencha Touch, by contrast, one of the other frameworks I mentioned, very much the opposite. You instead write a whole lot of JavaScript code to create your user interface. jQuery Mobile is meant to be much more lightweight and much simpler. Yeah? So it's a good question. Let me summarize as, doesn't this get confusing, or doesn't this paint you into a corner if things change over time, or you just have to remember all of the various aspects of some fairly proprietary, if open source, design? Short answer, yes. And that's sort of one of the trade-offs you make, whether or not you implement something entirely on your own, using pure, raw HTML, your own CSS, your own JavaScript code, or you try to save time and stand on the shoulders of other people who hopefully have a good community behind them, who have good documentation behind them, to save yourself the hour, the 10 hours, the 100 hours that it would otherwise take just to kind of come up with this overarching framework. So short answer, yes. It's definitely a downside, but if it means you can finish the project in 10% of the amount of time, that too could be compelling. You could implement it 10 times over the next few years as things change. But definitely a challenge overall. Other questions? Yeah?
It looks a little bit like you define all the pages in one HTML page actually from this example.
Indeed.
That's something that's always the case with jQuery Mobile.
With jQuery Mobile, at least with this particular user interface that I've chosen, yes, all of the HTML and all of the pages are in one arguably big HTML file. And the motivation for that is largely so that you can do the seamless transitions with as little latency as possible. If you instead had to fetch more content with every transition, you might introduce a second, maybe even 2 seconds or more of delay, and that would make it feel even less like a native app. You can do that, and you can tell the browser to go fetch those pages dynamically, which frankly is necessary if you had more than 3 pages, maybe had 3,000. You just wouldn't want to send a 10 megabyte file down, but that too is a trade-off, and you have to decide where the line is between convenience and size. Good question. All right, so let's pluck off a few smaller details, smaller features of HTML5 that we can leverage here in order to make pages all the more mobile friendly. So if I switch back to this screen here and move us ahead to here, there we go. So here's a new one, another meta tag. So Apple has made ample use of this meta tag, which again today some of you have probably never used, or you've used it for some search engine optimizations. So here is one called Apple Mobile Web App Capable. If its content is quote unquote yes, what do you think this means? It is indeed mobile web app capable. What does that actually translate into? So most iPhone users don't actually do this, but you might know that if you're visiting a web page in Safari and you decide, wow, I really like this website, I want to return to it in the future, you can either, one, bookmark it, which is very 1990s style, or what else can you do if you've ever actually done this? What's that? So you can actually add it to the home screen. So if I go to, let's go back to my iOS simulator, which again will have you download in a week or two's time. And I go back to my directory of code. Let me go back, and let me go into tonight's. Well, that would spoil the surprise of what I see here. Yes? Fix that later. So if I go into my HTML5 page, folder, and scroll down here, and I go to, let's say, app.html. This is a super simple app. I spent like 5 seconds making it. All it has is an image tag. But I really like this image, and so I want to not only bookmark it, I actually want to have an icon on my home screen that forever shows this icon complete with the glistening Apple sparkles that makes it look like a very three-dimensional button. But how do you do that? Well, let me go to this same page in my browser, just so I can zoom in on it over here. And you'll see the same boring website, but underneath the hood in the source, notice that I've included this. And I've also jumped the gun and also included this, which, aptly named, makes the Apple Mobile Web App status bar style, quote unquote, black. So instead of getting the default blue or some other color, I just want the status bar at the top of my Safari instance to be black in this case. So if I go to my mobile browser and click on this icon here, which any iPhone user has, notice here in the middle, I have an icon, Add to Home Screen. If I did not have that mobile-friendly feature enabled, we couldn't do this. I'm going to go ahead and add this to my home screen. It's called Harvard App. It's pulling that from the title tag of the web page. And now it's here on my desktop. And now I have an icon on my desktop. So I can now forever get back to this app by clicking this. And notice the status bar is black. And notice, you can't quite see my fingers doing this, but if I click on the screen or touch the screen and try to drag down, what is absent? Yeah, so the address bar, the URL bar that's usually there. But this is Safari. But it's mimicking the idea of a native application by not revealing to me that it's Safari. But the only reason it did that was because in my HTML, I proactively, if verbosely, told the browser that it is mobile web app capable. So that's all that meta tag does. And there's a bunch of others that do similar tweaks to your interface. The status bar style we just saw. The Apple Touch icon can also be defined here. So if you define Apple Touch icon to be some ping, and there's actual pixel specifications you can read up online or just match the one that we included here, that's how you can specify what icon shows up. So it's not the default fav icon or whatever black and white icons there by default. You can do a pre-composed one. So if you really don't like Apple's sort of three-dimensional glistening of your icons, which they add for you to your icon, you can say, I have a pre-composed ping, which means I'm really good at Photoshop. I made the three-dimensional button myself. Don't add additional gloss to it. So there's that feature as well. And then startup image. If you have a really crappy website that takes a really long time to load, you can show the user an image as it's loading up. It isn't necessarily a bad website. It might just be one that has to request a whole lot of data. If Gmail, frankly, needs to request a lot of data so that you can begin interacting with your folders and labels and your inbox. So Gmail, for instance, might have an icon implemented in this fashion here. So any questions on those more aesthetic tweaks that you can apply? All right, so where does that leave us? In order to get that slightly more dynamic interface, even though it was imperfect with Jquery Mobile, we added this last line of yellow text in a language called JavaScript. Some of you, many of you might not even know JavaScript, or at least the aspects of it that we're going to leverage for mobile. But let's pause here, take a look at the course itself before diving back into actual development. So this is building mobile applications. What does that actually mean? The prerequisites for the class, as you might have seen in the course catalog, are simply these: prior programming experience in any object-oriented language. So that could be something like Java, C++, C#, or any number of other languages. But the goal is to have students in this course have comfort already on the way in with the notion of classes and objects and instance variables and class variables, even if you know some of those things by different names. So if you're on the fence about your preparedness for the course, or not sure if what you learned is consistent with our expectations, during the break that we'll take in a bit, or at the end of this class tonight, do come up to chat with me or others of the staff who I'll introduce in a bit to see if we're on the same page as you, so that frankly, you don't have a bad experience over the next several weeks simply because you don't have the requisite knowledge. 6, 7 weeks is going to really fly by, and if you're trying to learn the prerequisites for the course while trying to follow the course, it could certainly be more than an arduous task. So touch base with us if unsure. Comfort with HTML and CSS. If you didn't really bat an eye at anything we just did, that's good. If you're unfamiliar with HTML or CSS, it's probably not going to be ideal, but in fairness, we'll spend just a week or two on the mobile web aspect of the course. So if you're really here and fired up about the Objective-C and the iOS aspect, talk to us too during the break or after about exactly what you do or don't have as experience. You don't, as you've perhaps inferred, need an actual iPhone, iPad, or iPod for the course. You can do everything in the confines of a simulator. You do pay a price for that, in that you can't have access to like the accelerometer. So like even shaking your laptop's not going to do anything to the simulator. So you do not have quite as much functionality. But if you do have an iOS device of some sort, you can use it for the course, certainly to test your mobile apps, but also your native apps. The catch is that Apple doesn't like to let us install software rewrite on our own hardware unless we pay Apple for that privilege. So you actually typically need to sign up for what's called an iOS developer account, which typically is $99. If you plan on doing iOS development after the course, so 7 weeks hence, it's probably a good thing to sign up for anyway, even right now, so that you use your Apple ID, so that you can download betas. For instance, I'm running iOS 7 on my phone already because it's accessible to people who are in the developer program. But if you think at the end of the semester you're not going to try to put something in the App Store and you therefore don't really need access for a year, it's an annual fee, we have an academic account which won't let you submit to the App Store, but will let you install software that you write on your computer onto your phone or your iPad or iPod. So we'll set you up with that in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll ask you for your Apple IDs and more at that point. So you don't have to pay for anything. You don't have to sign up for anything. But if you're going to be doing this for the next year, you might as well do it sooner rather than later, so you don't have to transition from our account to yours in a couple of months' time. Any questions on prerequisites? All right, so expectations, pretty straightforward. To attend all of the lectures and labs, more on those in just a moment, and submit all of the projects, more on those in a moment. Lectures, this is lecture. The focus will be on 1 week on web apps, namely this one, with a project that itself will take 2 weeks, and then 5 of the course's weeks on native applications, Objective-C, iOS, and related features thereof. This is an incomplete list of the topics and the concepts that we'll be looking at. We'll go into more detail over the coming weeks as to what it means to develop native applications. We definitely will not cover the entirety of the iOS SDK. As Apple likes to say, They just released another 1,500 APIs as of 2 weeks ago with iOS 7. There's thousands of APIs for them means method or variable, apparently. But the API itself is very rich. There's things like the map SDK with which you can embed maps, and there's the touch interface, and there's a storage layer, there's a database layer, and all sorts of ancillary ones. What we'll do in our time together over the summer is try to focus on really the most fundamental and the ones that are most representative of other SDKs, so that when you decide to write your own application, even if we never, for instance, use the gyroscope, at least the framework and the mental model will be similar from aspects of the language that we did do. Whoops, let's just zoom out for a moment and then zoom back in on labs. So what are labs? So per the course catalog, labs are going to be the hands-on aspect of the course that'll take place same time, but on Wednesdays of each week, led by the course's teaching fellows. And these will be opportunities for you to bring your laptops as well. We'll meet not here, but in a more classroom-structured environment across the hall and set up workstations for everyone. And it will be a mixture of hands-on opportunities to explore recent materials, so things similar in spirit to what we did tonight, to explore the week's projects, and to get some hints and tips and tricks as to how to dive into those. And also an opportunity for one-on-one Q&A with the course's staff, generally toward the end of those labs. We'll reserve some time for office hours-like environments so you can work on your projects alongside classmates, but have the support structure of some of us there to field questions for you. The website is here, as you might have found already, cs76.net. Discuss is the web-based tool that we'll use over the course of the summer to interact. Rather than rely on email, which ends up going only to us and back to you, we'll generally point you toward Discuss, which is the course's discussion forums. You can still post questions to the staff privately there. There's a link on the course's website to Discuss. And what we'll ask that you do for the first project is say hello to your classmates. So if you'd like to get ahead, there's a general category in the Discuss boards, and you're welcome to say hello, a little something about yourself, and perhaps why you are interested in iOS development. There's more. OK. Projects. So the projects are really where you'll get your hands dirty in the course and retain the most, and I think learn the most. There'll be 3 total projects. 2 of them are our choices of specifications. We will specify exactly what the challenges are. The third one, though, will be your choice for you to propose to the course's staff and then design and implement your very own project. The first 2 that are signed, one will be themed mobile local. More on that Wednesday, but it will involve using browser's Geolocation API, using open data sets, and mashing things together into an interface that allows users to explore news and weather, all based on their current location. Evil Hangman, meanwhile, will be an implementation in iOS of Hangman, but much more evil than you're used to, whereby rather than just have you guess the letters that the computer is thinking of, which is a very boring game once you're a few years older than when you probably last played it, the evil Hangman version of this cheats, such that any time you guess a letter like E, the computer, or in this case your phone or iPad or iPod, is going to change the word it was thinking of and re-choose a word that's the same length but that has no E's. And when you proceed to guess A, it's going to throw away the word it was thinking about and make sure it has no E's or A's. And when you choose C, it's going to make sure the word it's thinking of is still the same length but has no E's, A's, or C's, until finally it beats you by coming up with the word like dog, which you should have thought of, but damn it, the thing was cheating the whole time. And so implementing this and calling it not Evil Hangman, but Hangman, and having your friends play it is a wonderful way to make them think that they're awful at Hangman. All right, so more on that to come. Grades in the course. It's fairly straightforward. Performance in the course will be determined by the projects. No exams, no attendance records, nothing beyond the course's actual workload and immersion. We'll evaluate them on 4 different axes. Scope, the extent to which you tackled the project itself. Did you bite off all of the features, or did you only even try half of it? Correctness, to what extent is it consistent with our expectations? Design, how good is it underneath the hood? How well designed is it? So a more subjective measure. And style, a more aesthetic measure. Are your variables well named? Are things nicely indented? Or is everything pretty printed, so to speak? These are the 4 axes, and they'll be weighted roughly in order in which you'll spend time on them, with style being weighted the least, but still important, correctness being worth the most, because that's arguably where you'll spend most of your time getting things to work just right. And the app party. So at the very last week of the class, Wednesday, August 7th at 6:30 p.m., we will meet standing up with laptops and with some cake and more. You're welcome to bring family and friends, and this will be an opportunity really just to share and demo for each other the individualized projects that you chose to do, or even your own implementations of mobile, local, or evil Hangman, to share with the class the different design directions that you chose and see exactly what everyone accomplished. So it should be a fun way to end the term. The cameras, meanwhile, in the class. Technically, this class is not on the internet. It's an on-campus class only, but what we always do in the summer is try to experiment with new approaches to videography, try out new things, new experiments. This TV is new, and this is my first time using it. So again, forgive any gaffes. We can fix them all in post-production. But what we will do on an experimental basis is post the videos that we're taking tonight and in subsequent classes online on the course's website. So if you absolutely can't make it some night, or if I was particularly confusing one night and you want to rewatch it, or fast forward, or rewind, or slow down, we'll start posting within a few days the course's videos so that you have those there as a reference as well. If you're camera shy and don't want to be on the internet and on YouTube and the like, we'll always reserve this swath of seats. So all of you folks will not appear in any of tonight's footage, even accidentally. So those first two columns of seats in the middle, if you just never want to be seen whatsoever, we'll always set aside seats there. Lastly, or second to lastly, let me introduce two of the fellows sitting over here, RJ and Rob, who will be on board as the course's teaching fellows, working with us in labs on Wednesdays, providing feedback on work, answering questions with me on Discuss. Would you each like to come up and say a word? Surprise. You have to talk. You just have to talk close to my chest. Because of the microphone.
Yeah. Hi. That's one word.
Rob.
I'm Rob.
So, all right, I'll redeem this. So Rob recently graduated from the college and is going to be working with us in an academic capacity over the coming years with courses like this one. RJ is a rising senior at the college and is also a teaching fellow for one of our undergraduate classes as well. So that was RJ and Rob. Lastly, before we take a break, one of the goals of bringing this TV online tonight was so that we could have a little of this in motion. So why don't we, first let me change state here. Pull this up, and let's take a 5 or so minute break. Whoever would like to come up and play Fruit Ninja on the TV is welcome to, and RJ, Rob, and I will field questions off to the side, and about 5 minutes from now we'll regroup. There are bathrooms down at the other end of the hallway. If you also go to the other end of the hallway and turn left and go down a smaller hallway, there's vending machines, candy and soda. We'll see you in a few. Someone better come up quick. So we are back, and we're about to teach all of JavaScript so that we can then dive into the project this coming Wednesday. So the assumptions I'd like to make here is, one, that folks are familiar with some object-oriented language. JavaScript, as we'll see, is object-oriented. It doesn't have classes per se, but you'll see a lot of the same ideas that you've seen in other languages. We'll focus, too, on just the very basics of syntax. You should find that it's incredibly similar to most any C-style language, C, C++, and so forth. And you will also find that it has most of the constructs, objects, arrays that you might expect in a higher level language like this. And we'll work our way from the simplest of examples to things more complex, ultimately ending with things like AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which will underlie the programmatic features that we need for this coming first project. So first, a snippet again of HTML. So this is an HTML5 web page, but we can also call this a DOM, Document Object Model, which is just a fancy way for saying tree. Even though we draw the HTML like this, you can actually think of it like a family tree whose root node, so to speak, is the HTML node. So let's throw away the doc type declaration, which actually doesn't really fit into this mental model for now. But the root of this page is the HTML tag. And how many children would you say that this root of the family tree has? So it has two, one of which is head and body. So there's head and then there's body. And in turn, head and body have some number of children. So head seems to have how many children? So 1. As an aside, if you really want to be nitpicky, technically head has as many as 3 children because there's some white space here and there, and there's also some white space after the title. Most browsers throw this away, and you don't have to worry about it. But as an aside, technically you could argue there's 3 nodes. All right, but we'll assume that it's just 1. It's a title. How many children does the title element have? So it is 1. So we won't dwell on this, but there are different types of nodes in a DOM, different types of nodes in this tree, one of which is an element node. And an element is the result of having a start tag and some stuff, and a close tag, a start tag and an end tag, an open tag and a close tag. Those collectively compose what's known as an element. Meanwhile, this would be known as a text node. There's also comment nodes, which we don't have examples of here, but if you do open bracket bang dash dash, that begins what would be called a comment node. But we'll focus just on these two most common ones. So meanwhile, the body tag, or the body element, to be proper, has how many children? 2. Each of which in turn seems to have 1 child. Now there's an anomaly here. There's this href, which I didn't bother giving a URL to because it's not really necessary for discussion. But this, is href a child of the anchor tag? So it's not. It doesn't really fit into the same hierarchical mental model that we're describing here. So we're going to draw it a little differently. Indeed, if I were to draw this picture as a tree, just using rectangles to represent the nodes, I might draw it as this. I have a document node, and this is the detail I said I was going to wave my hand at earlier. Turns out that there is an uber node, the document node. And for those familiar with JavaScript, you might have seen this before, the document global variables. We'll come back to that. But here's our root element, HTML. Indeed, it has 2 children, head and body, each of which has a title tag over here and a child of that. This guy has an anchor tag and an h1 tag, each of which has a textual child. And then just because it definitely doesn't belong below the node, implying that it's child, I'll arbitrarily draw the attribute laterally off to the side. So it's an attribute of the node, but it's not a child per se. So who cares about this detail? Well, if you start thinking about the HTML you see and the HTML you write as ultimately constituting a tree, once that HTML is parsed, that is read top to bottom, left to right by a browser, loaded into memory as an actual data structure, namely a tree, this is what it might look like inside of your computer's RAM. And this is a useful way of thinking about it, because now that as we begin to dive into JavaScript, JavaScript is increasingly being used to take a tree like this and massage it into a different tree, adding nodes, subtracting nodes. Already, if you're a Facebook user or a Gmail user, things happen quite dynamically these days. If you get an email with Gmail, the whole page does not reload certainly these days. Instead, you just get a new row in the middle of the web page. That row is probably a tr or something like that inside of a table tag, maybe, or maybe it's a div, but something like that. How is Gmail updating the inside of its web page? It's using JavaScript to insert more rectangles like these somewhere into the middle of the page. Facebook, when you get a Facebook chat or a status notification or a tweet that pushes everything else down, what's happening? This language called JavaScript is inserting a new node or rectangle into the tree and pushing everything else down or to the side, depending on how the programmer decided to do it. So that's what's been happening all this time underneath the hood, and we'll see how to do that ourselves momentarily. So JavaScript. How do you go about writing JavaScript? Well, historically, it runs client-side inside of a browser. So if you've got a website written in PHP or Python or Ruby, you might have JavaScript in that site, but it's not getting executed by your server. It's being sent to the server via HTTP over the internet, and then the browser is reading that JavaScript code just like it reads the HTML, top to bottom, left to right, and executing it on your own Mac or PC. So where do you put the JavaScript? Well, we've seen already you can have script tags. We haven't seen them with stuff in between, but the simplest way to start writing JavaScript, as we'll see, is to just put it inside of an open script and a closed script tag, just like that. But of course, you're probably more familiar already with this format. Just to recap, what does this line of HTML do? What does it tell a browser to do? Exactly. Load file.js and treat it as a file containing JavaScript code. So if there's code in it, it should be executed, top to bottom, left to right. So we'll see how to actually embed that in a web page. What about the language itself? Here I'm going to take a shortcut and just wave my hand at all of the syntactic features of JavaScript. Why? Most of these keywords, if not all of them, are probably familiar to you no matter what language you've actually used before. A couple might be new, might not have used the for-in construct before, might not have used try-catch if you're not familiar with exceptions, might not have seen var before, but it's just what we use to declare a variable. But you can probably guess what most of these do. So break is usually used inside of a loop or a switch to break out of it. And we'll go through this quickly. These are the details we'll come back to over time as needed. And any number of online references can reinforce. Const specifies that it should be a constant value. Continue means to do another iteration of a loop without necessarily proceeding further down below the line of code. Do while means do something again and again, but check the condition at the bottom instead of at the top. For starts a loop. For in is useful when you want to iterate over an array. It's just a shorthand way of typing out a traditional for loop, as we'll eventually see. Function says here comes a function. It's you have to explicitly say here comes a function with that keyword. If else, got to be familiar. Return, got to be familiar. Switch is just a different way of writing an if, else if, else if, else statement. Throw relates to exceptions. You'll see these a little bit in JavaScript, but we won't spend much time on them. They're also present in iOS, but not super commonly used, at least in the APIs we'll mostly spend our time in. But it's a way of handling errors. Instead of returning -1 or returning false or null or some sentinel value like that, throw and try and catch are mechanisms in languages like JavaScript that allow your code to just throw up an error, and typically they'll kill the program unless you have written code defensively to catch a potential such thrown exception. And we'll see if these come up today or in the future. Var lets you declare a variable, and while just starts a loop. And there's a few other things, but the rapidity with which we just went through that is just to suggest that JavaScript, even if new to you, is probably pretty familiar based on most any other language you've used. How do you declare an array? So an array, what's really nice about JavaScript is that it makes nice use of syntactic sugar, which means using shorthand notation to do common things. Open square bracket, close square bracket gives you an empty array. You can also write out the word array, capital A-R-R-A-Y, open paren, close paren, calling effectively a constructor for the array class. But it's not really called a constructor, and it's not really called a class. So the more common way of seeing it anyway is just to have open bracket, square bracket. So we'll see that in some examples eventually. And to get an empty object, we use curly braces. And we're back. So let's go about actually implementing some simple JavaScript examples, working our way up to more compelling examples, particularly ones that leverage some mobile-specific features. For instance, we'll leverage a feature of HTML5 that's particularly useful in a mobile context if you want to store data persistently, even offline potentially without internet access, called local storage. We'll also take a look at the Geolocation API, which allows you in JavaScript code to ask the browser and in turn the iOS phone or iPad or iPod, where am I in the world, and actually get back some GPS coordinates and also a measurement of just how accurate that estimation is. So let me go back to the sample code for tonight. I'm inside of the JS directory. And let me go into the dom0.html file. So again, if you go to cs76.net, if you haven't already, you can download all of this code to play along at home. And if you pull up this page, you get a super simple example. It apparently is a form with a text field and with a form field. And let me go ahead and view the page's source so we can see what's going on underneath the hood here. And let's first focus on what's familiar. Let me scroll to the bottom, and we see a body tag. We see inside of that body a form tag, an ID. What's an ID attribute used for if you've not used it before? Or if you have used it before? Exactly. So if you've not used it before, the ID attribute, which can be applied to most any HTML tag, allows you to uniquely identify it in the DOM. It's totally the honor system. It's up to you, the developer, to make sure that you don't give any other element the same ID, but it allows you to have quick access to a particular element, not only in CSS and in your style sheets, but also, as we'll see, in JavaScript code. So you don't have to go searching through the whole tree trying to find a node of interest. So we'll come back to onSubmit. Let's dive into input. So I have apparently given an ID of name to an input tag that has a placeholder. So this is interesting. It turns out that in HTML5, there's actually a few useful attributes that you might not have seen before. So let's actually suspend this thread for just a moment. Let me go back into our earlier directory just to make sure folks have seen this. And if I go into inputs.html, notice this too is a form without even a submit button, because my goal isn't to submit this form, but just to demonstrate different types of form fields. Now they're going to wrap a little bit because the lines are long, but notice in this form I have 3 input tags, and I've got an auto capitalize equals quote unquote off attribute. You can probably guess what that does. Tells the phone, in most cases, don't try auto capitalizing this, which can be annoying. Autocomplete equals quote unquote off. That just disables the little drop down that will often appear if you previously typed something into the field. It's pretty common on desktop browsers. Autocorrect equals off. increasingly helpful on mobile devices and also supported on more and more desktop browsers. Just means don't correct my spelling. Placeholder equals quote unquote. That puts what in the text box? Yeah, placeholder text, like grayed out text that's there until you click on it or start typing. So it's just useful for instructions. And then finally, type. This is interesting too. This first one has type equals text, which is old school. But notice in HTML5, you can have type equals email and type equals URL. Now, that does not mean that the browser is going to validate the field for you. You can type in any word you want into an email field, and you won't get yelled at just because it doesn't look like an email address. Similar for the URL. You can type in any word you want, even if it's not a URL. The browser's not going to yell at you. So why in the world would the browser care what type of field this should be?
Does Safari add the @ symbol to email?
What do you mean add the @ symbol?
Like in the keyboard?
Ah, so the keyboard, but not my physical keyboard.
No, but if you're on an iPhone.
Yeah, so indeed, let's go back to Safari in the simulator here. Let's go back to the directory listing and go to inputs. And now notice what happens. If I click on the first of these inputs, the very top one was just type equals text. Notice that I get this keyboard. Okay, pretty uninteresting. Done. Now if I click on the email field, see how good your recall is. What changed? So you get a smaller space bar and the @ sign there. So it's just for the user's convenience. And what are we probably going to see if we instead dismiss this and click the URL field? Exactly. It changes ever so slightly, and I also get the slash for easy access. So it's just a little bit of icing on the cake for the user to make it easier to interact with your site. All right, so now let's go back to the example we were at before, which was not this one here, but with just the DOM0 file in the JS directory that looked like this. So notice at the bottom, I've added a couple of other things to the input tag. Placeholder equals quote unquote name, just to be explanatory. Type equals text, so no special keyboards. Finally, an input of type equals submit. But there's something else here that you might not have used before. But you can probably guess what it does. This attribute called onSubmit presumably tells the browser to call a function called greet when the form is submitted. How do you submit a form? Well, you either click the physical submit button, or if you're on a desktop computer, you hit the enter key. That will often do it as well. So in either case, the act of submitting a form happens. But with this onSubmit attribute, you're telling the browser, listen for that event, so to speak. And JavaScript and web programming more generally is very much event-driven. When that form is submitted, an event happens, and onSubmit is an event handler, a listener that's waiting to hear that event of submission. And what should it do? Well, we don't know much JavaScript yet, most likely, but it looks like code. And indeed, I should call a greet function with no arguments, and then I should return false. And we'll come to back to greet in a second. Return false. What would that possibly mean, to return false inside of an attribute, inside of a form tag? Exactly. So what might you want to stop when a form is submitted? Well, the form being submitted itself to the server. If the whole point right now is to start writing code that runs on the client side, inside of the browser, we don't even need a server once we've downloaded the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript, right? We can lose internet connectivity altogether, potentially, if all of the code is running locally on my phone or iPad or iPod right now. So onSubmit just says, call the greet function, but no matter what happens, do not actually submit this form. So it's your chance to intervene. So now let's scroll up to the top of the file. Most of it's pretty boring, HTML, title tag, head tag, and all of that. But notice toward the top of the file, I've introduced that script tag. And then I've put right there in the script tag, function greet. So we promise that the function keyword means here comes a function. Then open paren, close paren means it takes no arguments. Open curly brace, close curly brace defines the scope of the function. And it's a one-line function. Turns out in JavaScript, there's a function that's super useful, but not to be used in production code, that just opens a pop-up. If you remember 8, 10 years ago, when pop-ups were very much in vogue and alerts were very much in vogue, that's how you invoke them. That's one way of opening prompts on a user screen. So what is this going to do? Well, let's take a quick glance at some syntax, but you can probably guess what this is doing based on other languages. It's wrapping a bit because the line is long, but this is calling alert, passing in a single argument of type string. So JavaScript does have the notion of data types, as we'll see. Quote, unquote, with a comma, hello. And what do you think the plus is doing? Concatenation. So you've seen this in Java. If you're a PHP programmer, you've seen dot. Other languages use different symbols. Now document.getElementById of name. Now, I had no idea until a second ago that function existed, but it seems that a function called getElementById exists. It's associated with some kind of global variable called document. So more properly, it's a method inside of an object called document. What is that object called document? Well, if we go back to the screen from earlier, recall that, the document node. If you've programmed JavaScript already and you ever use document dot something, you've essentially been talking to that guy who has some special functionality built in. And clearly he's important because he can see the entirety of the tree from his vantage point. So if we now go back to my own code, document.getElementById does exactly what you think it does. Give me the element from the tree. Give me the rectangle whose ID is quote unquote name, which is what type of element, just to be clear? Not a string per se. What type of HTML element was it? An input. So give me the rectangle that represents the input whose ID is name in that tree structure. Why? Because I then want to dive in deeper and get its value. So here's the object-oriented nature of JavaScript. The dot means go inside of this object, go inside of this object, and get some member function or member variable, data field. So document's an object. It has a method called getElementById. That method returns, apparently, an object, a rectangle, that represents that node from the tree. And one of its properties, something inside of that rectangle, is apparently a property, a data field, data value, whatever you want to call it, an instance variable called value. That gives you the value that the user typed into that field. So what is the net effect, in layman's terms, of this line of code? To trigger an alert with what text? Hello, so-and-so, whatever your name actually is. So let's give this a try. Let's go back to the web page itself. Let me go ahead and type in Rob and click Submit. And there it is, hello, Rob. It's definitely a poor man's user interface in that we're just triggering this browser-dependent screen. Chrome even gives its own logo here. So there's other ways of doing this, but clearly we've dynamically gotten some data from that DOM element. But hopefully we can do a bit better. So let me actually roll back, not to 0, but to dom1.html. The form is going to be the same, but let's instead introduce a slightly different approach here. So in this version, what appears to be different at first glance, even if you can't read all of the lines in question? I moved the script. I moved the script down below. All right, why did I do that? Or what's the effect of this? There's a few things different here. Well, let's take a look. So one, it's an important detail that the form is now coming before the script. Because one of the conclusions we reached earlier is that JavaScript's reading of a page, or browser's parsing of a page is synchronous. It does things one at a time, at a time, at a time. So in fact, as a tangent, if you've ever used Google Analytics or you use like the Facebook like button, actually Google Analytics specifically tells you to put their code where? Sorry? At the end, right above the close body tag. Why? Well, just in case Google servers are slow or the user has a slow connection to Google but not to you, Google doesn't want to be responsible for slowing down the loading of your web page lest the user see nothing until Google also loads its JavaScript cookie tracking code at the bottom. Now, the last time I looked, Facebook tells you to put their code where? Okay, right after the open body tag, thereby giving it more priority. But in their defense, the way Google loads code into your page is they actually retroactively go back and inject it into the top of the page, so it's not actually a blocking call. So different subtleties that we'll not spend time on here, but that's the motivation for those different design decisions is how will the page's loading be affected. So let's see what the relevance here is. Here's my form. I've this time given it an ID of demo so that I can uniquely identify the form element itself. I have the same input and submit button as before. And then down here I have a script. But notice my code has changed a little bit. What's the first syntactic difference that you see this time that wasn't here before? Yeah?
Oh, well, return false is not after the alternate like it was in the original one. It's below or
OK, good. So notice that return false is below the HTML itself. It's not inside of the HTML. In fact, there's no onSubmit attribute anymore. Instead, we seem to be manipulating a property called onSubmit. So again, to the object-oriented nature of JavaScript, it turns out that just as there's this global document object, inside of which is a method called getElementById, that in turn is going to return the element whose ID is demo. And which element is that? What type of element? It's a form. It turns out that form elements have a property called onSubmit. And this is not a property whose value is supposed to be a number or a string. It's supposed to be a function pointer, so to speak, a reference to a function, the address of a function. Think of it however you'd like based on what language you have as a background. So onSubmit equals, what does this mean? Notice that on the right-hand side here, there's the keyword function again, open paren, close paren. But what is absent this time from the function declaration? There's no name of this function. But it doesn't matter, right? Because what I'm actually doing here is clearly creating what seems to be an anonymous function. It's a function with no name, otherwise known as a lambda function. And when you call the function keyword in this way, notice I have the open curly brace, then some stuff, then close curly brace, semicolon. So I've declared in these few lines of code an anonymous function, but because I have an equal sign right before it, I'm essentially storing the address of that function, a pointer there too, or a reference to that function where? As the value of this onSubmit property. The browser has been defined, meanwhile, to know if this onSubmit property, previously null, is set to a valid reference of a function when the form is actually submitted by the user by clicking submit or hitting enter on a physical keyboard. Find this value, call that function, and return true or false based on what it tells you to do. So clearly it's returning false. What else is it doing? It's also doing the alert, but the alert thing is the same as before. So what have we done? We've removed the onSubmit attribute from the HTML, replaced it instead with pure JavaScript code. Why? What's an argument in favor of this approach? Yeah?
Well, for some reason, if the browser doesn't like JavaScript, or if the JavaScript breaks, the form itself is not going to crash your browser.
OK, good. So just in case we're using a browser that has some incompatibilities, by moving the code outside of the context of the form, the script is more likely to be ignored. And indeed, that should be the case. Even browsers that have JavaScript off should just ignore the contents of this tag. So it's not a bad thought. In reality, I don't think it would end up being a problem, because if the browser just doesn't support JavaScript, the fact that we had onSubmit equals quote unquote something should also be ignored in the same way. But not a bad approach. Yeah?
Similar to MVC approach, we abstract a model from the view.
Good. So we'll come back to the jargon of MVC probably in a week or two. But for now, let's summarize it as my code was getting a little sloppy. Not only did I have HTML and then also some CSS in that file up above in previous examples, now I'm putting actual logic, programming code inside of my markup language, whose name suggests it should be for markup, making things bold, making things centered, structuring a page. Should have nothing to do fundamentally with code. So in the interests of keeping my coding life separate from my markup life, this is generally a better approach. It's not perfect, because frankly, it's like half a foot away from where it was before. So we haven't really solved this problem. But keeping code separate from logic and presentation is a key theme that we'll come back to, because it permeates the iOS SDK and the environment for writing iPhone apps. But this is at least a step toward that. And also, if we're only calling this function onSubmit, we definitely don't need to give it a name. If I'm the only person ever calling this code, I called it greet before, but I didn't even really need that name, because clearly I can do without it entirely.
What's the difference between single quote and double quote?
Good question. In JavaScript, none. I'm in the habit lately of using all single quotes for JavaScript and all double quotes for HTML, but there's functionally no difference in JavaScript. He's referring to the single quotes I had around demo, for instance. This would be a matter of style, too. For the projects, if you have a religion about single and double quoting, that's fine. Just be self-consistent with respect to your own code.
That's all in this episode. I hope this tutorial was helpful. In the next episode, we will cover the remaining part and the last part of this course, which is iOS programming. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your questions on our forum. We will be really happy to clear all your doubts. If you missed anything and want to rewatch it, you can download it from our website or can watch online as well. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with the subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Millionlights and also on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, app development, programming, and building rich UIs, keep watching Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.